Hi, witches. I'm Blair Bathory, and this is the Something Scary podcast. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first time or you're one of the brave souls who join us every week, there's nothing really scarier than getting lost in the woods. That's why you should always have a map on you. But when you lose your way and can't find help, sometimes the only thing you can do is turn your back to the danger and never look. First, something in the woods, followed by the real Blair Witch. Then, in our final story, what will the found footage reveal? Before we get to our stories, I wanted to let you know that I will be heading to Maryland for the 25th anniversary of the Blair Witch Project. That's why we're doing a special podcast on Blair Witch and other scary things that happen in the woods. And next Friday, I will be doing a live stream from Burkittsville, the filming location of the original film, with a very special guest, or two, and plan to join us. I can't wait to see you there. It would also be great if you could join our Patreon as a paying subscriber. I've seen a lot of you step up and subscribe, and I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. It's one of the ways you can help Something Scary continue to produce our episodes, and it only takes a minute and a few dollars a month. Thank you so much from myself and the team that brings you Something Scary. We are all incredibly grateful for the support of all of our listeners. So, wanna hear something scary? Blair Witch lives on. There is something inherently spooky about stories set in the woods, especially once it's dark. When the moon rises, even familiar territory can seem disorienting. Maybe this is a reason so many successful horror movies use the woods as a setting, with plenty of shadows for things unknown to lurk in, like in this story inspired by Isabella. Ella was super excited to sleep over at her friend Shylah's house. Their classmate Lily was staying too, and they'd planned the perfect night of scary movies, popcorn, and gossip. Partway through the evening, Shylah's older brother Ethan got back from hanging with his buddies and flopped down onto the sleeping bags with the girls. He grabbed some of the popcorn and settled down to watch the movie with them. They didn't mind. Ethan was fun, like a big brother to them all. Around 11 p.m., Shylah suggested they sneak out and head over to the fort they had built in the woods. Their house was in the countryside, surrounded by woodland. Shylah and Ethan had built the fort when they were kids, and now the girls used it as a place to hang out in. Ella was up for it. She loved an adventure, and despite it being almost midnight, it wasn't like they were headed into an abandoned building or anything. They wouldn't even be leaving Shylah's property. Lily wasn't sure, though. It was very dark, and since they were in the middle of nowhere, there weren't any streetlights. She was worried about tripping on the dirt path and injuring herself, getting lost in bug bites. Lily was always the one worrying, and the others teased her for it. A quick spritz of bug spray, however, and they were grabbing their flashlights and ready to hike the 15 minutes or so over to the fort. Shylah and Ethan's mom was a heavy sleeper, so they weren't concerned about waking her. The teens laughed and joked with each other as they trampled through the underbrush. They made spooky noises, spinning around their flashlights, trying to make one another jump. Once they reached the fort, as it was a fairly cool night, Ethan suggested they make a fire. They pulled out some rugs from an old chest they kept in a hideout, and soon the girls were all begging Ethan to tell them a ghost story. This had started as a joke a few years back when Ethan and Shylah were kids. He would try to playfully scare her with stories he'd heard at camp, but it backfired since she absolutely loved them and would beg him for more. Once she started having sleepovers, she would repeat the tales to Ella and Lily, but when they learned they'd originated from Ethan, they roped him into the job. He was a born storyteller. Now Ethan chuckled and said he had a really good one for them, but first they needed more firewood. Ella volunteered to go with him, while Shylah and Lily searched their bags for more snacks. As they walked away from the fire to find some dry sticks and twigs, Ella began to feel slightly uncomfortable, almost as if they weren't alone. She stopped and shone the flashlight around her, wondering if either Lily or Shyla had planned to sneak up on them, but there was no one there. Ethan asked what she was doing, just as she was about to explain that she had a weird sense they were being followed. Something even stranger happened. It was as if time stopped, but just for a few seconds. She tried to open her mouth to speak, but couldn't. She tried to move, but she was frozen. Then all of a sudden, the spell seemed to break and she was able to speak. She moved closer to Ethan and asked if she felt weird too. He explained that the darkness could be disorienting, and she was simply getting more tired as the night drew on. But there was nothing to worry about. There was no way anyone was there except them. Ella was still spooked though, and unable to shake the feeling as they grabbed some sticks and started to make their way back to the fort. They were extra vigilant with the flashlight, making sure their path was as well lit as it could be. About halfway back, Ethan let out a loud gasp. Ella immediately rushed over to him, grabbing his hand. He was a big guy, over 6 feet and well-built, and she knew he would protect her. "What's up?" she asked, not sure if she wanted to know. Ethan was pointing his flashlight onto the path. There was a huge animal footprint in the dirt. It was almost twice the size of Ella's own sneaker. "Let's get out of here," Ethan whispered loudly. They hurried back to the fort where Shyla was sitting by the fire. "Where's Lily?" she asked upon seeing them return. Ella frowned, feeling confused. Lily had stayed with Shyla. Why was she now asking where Lily was? Shyla explained that a minute or two after Ethan and Ella left, Lily had run after them saying she wanted to help too. Ethan looked worried as he explained to his sister they hadn't seen or heard Lily at all. "Then where?" Shyla began, but was interrupted by a terrible scream. "Lily!" They shouted together, and just as Ethan was about to run back into the woods, something appeared at the tree line in front of them. Something huge, well over 6 feet and stocky like a bear. Only when it stepped into the light from the fire, it looked like it had a head of a moose. Its matted fur, covered in dirt and blood, it carried the stench of rot and death, making them gag. The creature emitted a deep growl, and the teens turned and ran as fast as they could back in the direction of the house. The creature roared again and began to follow them, its heavy footfall echoing behind them. Pure fear spurred the teens on, and as they reached the house and bolted the door behind them, there was no sign of their tormentor. They raced up to Shyla's room, checking to see if Lily had simply wandered back without them and was asleep, but with no such luck. They waited all night, praying for her return. In the morning, they had to tell Shyla's mom, who immediately called the sheriff. There was a search party. People looked far and wide for Lily. All they ever found was her boot. One single boot. Of course, that's because when you have an ancient evil creature living on your land, sometimes it gets hungry, and when feeding time coincides with a sleepover, you know you won't have a full house in the morning. All you can do is cover your tracks and pray the monster's hunger is sated for now, and you won't become its next meal. Have you ever snuck out into the woods at nighttime? Did anything ever spooky happen? How would you have reacted if you saw the strange creature from this story? Lots of popular books and films are based on older legends and lore, or at the very least, greatly inspired by them, and often the most retold tales are the ones which remain to this day unexplained. The legend of the Bell Witch was one of many influences on the Blair Witch Project. 1817, Tennessee. John Bell hurried back into the kitchen. His children, including teenage son Drew and youngest daughter Betsy, were sitting at tables as his wife Lucy was serving dinner. John was out of breath as he held a shotgun in his hand. "What is it, John?" Lucy asked. John closed the sturdy door, making sure to put the bolt across. He looked unsure for a moment, then spoke. "I saw something strange outside in the corn. It had a dog's body and the head of some sort of rabid rabbit. I shot at it, but despite a perfect aim, It just disappeared. Lucy and the children looked at one another. John washed his hands and joined his family at the table, keeping the shotgun by the door. Maybe I'm sick or something. My mind playing tricks on me. He inhaled the steam from the stew and added, "This ought to see me right." They ate quietly until there was a loud bang on the side of the house. John got up and walked to the door. He listened intently and then motioned to Drew to follow him. Bang! At the second sound, they shot out of the door. They returned in a few moments, waited, and as they were about to sit again, bang! This happened 5 or 6 times, but on each occasion, when John and Drew went outside to look, there was absolutely nothing out there that could make that sound. Over the next few weeks, both Betsy and Drew complained there were rats in the bedrooms, gnawing at their beds while they slept. Betsy even claimed the vermin were climbing onto her bed and pulling off her quilt. Again, despite searching high and low, no culprits could be found, nor was there any other evidence of rats. Then things began to get even stranger. Lucy was making breakfast when Betsy appeared in the kitchen. She was crying, her hair a mess, and deep scratches down both sides of her face and arms. She had no idea where they'd come from. When Lucy checked her over, she noticed a bruise the shape of an adult handprint on her chest, too. And it wasn't the first time either. Poor Betsy had been suffering from these strange nocturnal attacks with no explanation for months. This time she appeared to be extra frightened. It was the old lady, she cried. She used to only whisper, sometimes sing hymns, but this time she was shouting. Lucy looked at Betsy in shock. Old lady? Through her tears, Betsy explained that she and the other children had been hearing the disembodied voice of a woman for a few weeks, which had coincided with the nocturnal attacks. John Bell decided enough was enough. He entrusted his neighbor, James Johnson, and his wife with the details of the events. Skeptical at first, the Johnsons agreed to spend the night in the Bell property. As they lay in bed that night, they too were subjected to the same torment the Bell children had been experiencing. Covers pulled from their bed, banging inside the walls, and worst of all, an old woman's voice which quoted scripture as James was slapped across the cheek. When they returned to the dining room for breakfast the following morning, the Johnsons claimed the Bells did indeed have an evil spirit on their hands. Over the years, the Bell Witch, as she came to be known, chose to focus her wrath upon young Betsy and John the most. The entity became stronger, able to coherently converse with people and appeared to know what was occurring within the family. When Betsy began courting a local man named Joshua Gardner, it seemed the witch did not approve of the match. The attacks continued as the voice repeatedly instructed Betsy not to marry Gardner. Yet although the spirit continued to harass Betsy, its true disdain was reserved for John Bell, whom it referred to as often as Old Jack. The witch relentlessly tormented John about killing him and took great pleasure in John's suffering. Around the same time as the entity had first manifested, John had become afflicted with a paralysis of the mouth, coincidentally a condition known today as Bell's palsy. The condition worsened as he became housebound, suffering from seizures. It was during these episodes that the witch could often be heard, cackling and even singing about the end of Old Jack. She would also trip him up and slap his face when he couldn't move. Then one morning in 1821, after a particularly bad seizure, John slipped into a coma. The following morning, he was dead. His son, John Jr., found a small, mysterious black bottle next to his father. No one had ever seen it before. Taking the vial, John Jr. placed 2 drops of the liquid contained within it onto the tongue of the stray cat they had kept around to catch mice. The poor creature convulsed and dropped dead. John Jr. then flung the vial into the fire where it burst into blue flames before disintegrating entirely. It seemed like the Bell Witch, who had been taunting John Sr. for years about his death, had won. John had been a popular man, and his funeral attracted a vast number of mourners, the majority of which witnessed the joyful singing emanating from an invisible guest. In fact, it was said that the witch did not stop belting out the tunes until the very last guest had left the ceremony. As well as mourning her father, Betsy was about to experience another loss. She and Joshua Gardner could not even meet outside of the house without disruption, and in the end, the stress of it all became too much and Betsy called off the engagement. This seemed to appease the spirit, and from then on, Betsy was pretty much left alone. In fact, it seemed that after the witch had fulfilled her promise of killing old Jack, she was pretty much content to leave the rest of the family alone. But the stories of the Bell Witch traveled far and wide, even attracting a well-known visitor, Andrew Jackson. Jackson, along with his entourage, visited the Bell property in 1819. As they neared the house, their wagon became stuck in the mud, and they were said to hear an old woman's voice taunting them. Later, one of the party, claiming to be a witch tamer, began jerking, claiming his body was being struck with pins, and the entire party heard an old woman screaming at them. Later, it was claimed Jackson said, "I would rather fight the British than fight the Bell Witch." There have been many proposed explanations for the Bell's haunting, and indeed whom the Bell Witch may have been, but it remains merely speculation. One thing that is clear, though, is how this legend inspires people today, including the creators of the Blair Witch Project phenomenon. Have you ever heard the story of the Bell Witch? Do you think that it could be true? Do you have any theories as to who the entity might have been, or why the Bells were exposed to this haunting? If you've ever experienced anything like the Bell family, tell us your story by sending us an email at SomethingScary@snarled.com. Found footage films were a fairly new concept in 1999 when the Blair Witch Project was first released, but they certainly weren't as prevalent as they are today. There is something especially chilling about this format, where the listener is learning things in real time along with the characters, like in this story inspired by Elilah. The Norwegian detective stared at her computer screen as she watched the footage downloaded from the cell phone belonging to the missing person. Lola Robinson had been visiting her maternal grandparents from the USA when they had reported her missing after a freak summer snowstorm. The snow appeared to have caused some devastation to the neighborhood where Lola's grandparents lived too. Trees had somehow been uprooted, cars crushed, and properties, including Lola's grandparents' house, damaged. Thankfully, no one else had been injured or reported missing, but that made the case all the more perplexing. Like a lot of teens, Lola had documented parts of the trip on her social media. Between that and videos she'd shot on her cell phone and not posted, Detective Larson had a few hours of footage to comb through. She had hoped it might yield some answers. July 1st, 2024. Video showing Lola at her home in Florida, USA, packing for her trip. She seems happy, excited. She tells the camera she's looking forward to her grandma's sweet, fluffy homemade bread every morning with her favorite jam, and that she misses her eccentric and boldly decorated bedroom. This transitions into her waving goodbye to her parents at the airport, and then footage of her getting onto the plane. July 1st, 2024. Lola telling the camera the flight had been long and boring, but she'd arrived safely in Bergen. Arriving at her grandparents' house, a 3-story, made of brick with many different kinds of flowers surrounding it. She wipes her feet on the welcome home mat and knocks on the door with a big smile on her face. The wooden door unlocks. Barking is heard along with the excited voice of her grandmother, who greets Lola with a huge hug. Lola then bends down and shows the camera her grandmother's dog, Louie, who is excited to see her. This transitions into Lola walking through the traditional-looking, comfortable and warm house, telling the camera it smells like cinnamon and wood fire. She then whips the camera around, and when we see an older man with white hair and laughter lines, her grandfather, he smiles, and Lola leaves the phone on the side to rush in for a big hug. July 2nd, 2024. Lola and her grandparents are chatting about how different Bergen is to Florida. Lola is telling them all about how sunny and warm it is and what the beach is like. She talks with them about school and what ping pong is and her favorite things to do in the summer. They laugh, and Lola points the camera to the window, telling everyone that it is unexpectedly cold. July 2nd, 2024. Later, they are playing board games, but Lola is falling asleep. Her grandmother says it's time for bed, and Lola carries her phone up the stairs with the dog Louie following her. She shows the camera her bedroom and says it's very cold. Not just Norway-type cold, it is freezing. She throws a thick blanket over the bed, with Louie curled up on her legs, and says goodnight to the camera. July 3rd, 2024. Timestamp 3 a.m. Lola is in bed, the blanket around her like a cape and illuminated with just the light from her phone. She tells the camera she has been woken up by a strange scraping or maybe growling noise. Also, she shows the camera Louie, who is sat up with his paws on the headboard, snarling at the window. "What's wrong, Lou?" She reaches out to pet him when he snaps at her, grazing her index finger. "Ow!" She pulls her hand back, seemingly in shock. "Louie!" She whispered loudly. "Stop it!" But the dog doesn't move, still growling at something. But then there is a sound like shuffling or thumping from outside the window, facing the camera, seeming curious more than scared. Lola says, "Let's go see what's making that noise, huh?" She moves over to the window with the phone, peeking out from behind the curtains. Detective Larson pauses the footage for just a moment, not sure what she's looking at or how to record it. She rewatches again, zooming in on the image. As she makes notes, she is glad she is typing, as she is sure her handwriting would have given away how shaken she is feeling. July 3rd, 2024, a large humanoid-type creature appears to be visible outside of the house. It is huge, much taller than the houses, even the trees. From the grainy footage and only the moonlight to illuminate it, it looks to be made of stone, and yet it is moving through the neighborhood as if it were alive. The creature had long horns that looked like logs draped in moss and dirt, and was carrying a tree trunk bigger than a house on its huge shoulder. The camera shows Lola staring out of the window in shock. She whispers, "No, it can't be," and then she screams. Knowingly or not, Lola keeps the camera running. It shows the creature acknowledging the sound and turning its massive head to look directly into Lola's window. It had large, sharp teeth poking out of its bottom lip and was made out of what looked to be large bones, sharpened and covered in a red stain. It let out a low, guttural growl, exposing all of its razor teeth before charging towards the house. The rest of the footage is shaky. It appears as if Lola is running. She appears to run down the stairs. Louie is shown to be following her. There is an extremely large crashing sound, and the camera spins around to show what looks like a large stone hand smashing through the bricks of the house as if it were made from butter. The film is quite blurred here, as it appears as if Lola is running again and the camera is facing the floor. This changes to white, as it seems she runs out of the house and onto the street, which is covered in thick snow. The camera whips around as if Lola is deciding to run towards it. All the vehicles are snowed in. All of the house is dark. The camera spins to show several trees that have been uprooted and power lines down. It also shows Louie is still by her side, his little body trembling. The cell seems to fall into the snow and shows Lola crouch down to pet Louie and say, "It's okay, Lou. I think it's gone now." Last footage on Lola Robinson's cell phone shows what looks to be a giant stone foot crashing down onto the screen of the cell, which goes black, and a guttural scream is heard before the phone seems to die and indicates perhaps Lola along with it. Detective Larson takes a deep breath, then a long gulp of strong black coffee. She may be an astute police officer, a brilliant detective, but she grew up with a superstitious family who believed in all the legends and lore of the land. Therefore, despite the impossibility of what she had just watched being real, she knew exactly what she had witnessed, what had become of Lola. The stone body, the large horns, collecting trees. That was a troll. There was no doubt that Lola was dead. The troll would have killed her, then taken her body to crush her bones. The only question Detective Larson had now was who had summoned it, and when would they strike again? Are you a fan of the found footage subgenre? Do you have a favorite? If so, are there any legends or lores that you think would be cool for a found footage type movie that hasn't been explored yet? This week's podcast stories were edited by Sarah Lukasiewicz, narration by Blair Bathory, audio edited and mixed by Fitz Harris, additional audio editing by Calvin Linderman. Produced by Ana Villalobos. Executive produced by Gail Gilman. Music by Sapphire Sandalo and Calvin Linderman.